Imagine a world waking up after the unimaginable chaos of World War III. The maps we've memorized since childhood would be almost unrecognizable. Countries that once wielded unquestioned power might be fractured or completely diminished, while others, previously overlooked, could emerge as the new architects of global influence. Borders would be redrawn not through treaties or elections, but through the stark reality of survival, occupation, and territorial disputes born from the ashes of war. In some regions, old alliances would dissolve entirely. Nations that once counted on each other for mutual defense might find themselves isolated, struggling to rebuild trust in a world where the old rules no longer apply. Meanwhile, unexpected coalitions could form, not out of shared ideology, but out of sheer necessity. Countries that had been on opposite sides of the spectrum might find common ground in resources, geography, or mutual security concerns. The power balance would shift dramatically, with some states gaining strength simply because they managed to preserve their infrastructure and population during the conflict. Even nations considered global superpowers before the war could find themselves in decline. Economic centers could be obliterated, industrial hubs turned into wastelands, and political systems destabilized beyond repair. The old hierarchies of power would no longer hold, the influence of nations would hinge less on wealth or military might and more on their ability to recover, adapt, and harness the remnants of technology and resources. Countries that were once minor players on the world stage might rise from the rubble, seizing opportunities to fill vacuums left by fallen powers. A country that had previously been reliant on international support might now control critical food or energy supplies, suddenly giving it a leverage it never held before. Meanwhile, the concept of sovereignty itself could be under pressure. Some regions might fracture into smaller, self-governing territories, especially in areas where governance was already fragile. Local militias or regional authorities could assume control, making the old national borders almost irrelevant. In certain parts of the world, cities might become city-states, isolated bastions of stability in an otherwise chaotic environment. In others, surviving nations might merge for mutual survival, creating political entities that seem almost alien compared to the countries we know today. History would become a patchwork of survival strategies, new power blocks, and constantly shifting allegiances. Global influence might also become tied less to military strength and more to resources and technology. Countries that retain access to water, arable land, and energy sources would find themselves at the center of power struggles. Nations that manage to protect their research facilities, technology hubs, or scientific communities could dictate the pace of reconstruction and innovation. In a post-war world, the traditional markers of dominance, armies, fleets, and economies, would matter, but so would adaptability, resilience, and the ability to negotiate in a world where trust is scarce and desperation is common. Finally, the psychological dimension of geopolitics cannot be ignored. Surviving nations would carry the scars of immense human loss, and that trauma could redefine diplomacy and strategy. Leadership would need to navigate not just reconstruction, but reconciliation, balancing the demands of populations that may have lost everything with the imperatives of national survival. Old rivalries might flare up anew, while new partnerships could become the foundation of a radically different world order. The post-WW3 era wouldn't simply be about rebuilding what existed, it would be about imagining what could exist in a world reshaped by devastation, where power is no longer inherited or assumed, but earned through resilience, strategy, and the will to survive. After the dust of global conflict settles, the physical world itself would tell a story of devastation far beyond anything most of us have imagined. Cities that once thrived with life, commerce, and culture might stand in eerie silence, their skylines reduced to jagged skeletons of steel and concrete. Entire neighborhoods could be leveled, leaving nothing but rubble and ash, while streets that once bustled with daily routines become unrecognizable corridors of destruction. Infrastructure, bridges, highways, airports, and railways, would be shattered, cutting off once busy regions from each other and isolating survivors in pockets of relative safety. The damage would not only be immediate, it would ripple outward, making reconstruction a monumental challenge. Electricity grids, water systems, and communication networks could be so thoroughly destroyed that even decades after the war, some regions might struggle to regain the simplest forms of modern life. Beyond the urban ruins, the natural world would bear the scars of humanity's final, catastrophic conflict. Nuclear strikes, if they occur, could leave vast areas uninhabitable for generations, their soil poisoned, their air heavy with radiation. Forests, rivers, and coastlines could be transformed, either scorched to nothing or contaminated in ways that prevent normal ecosystems from recovering. Even regions untouched by direct attacks would likely face severe environmental consequences. The global climate could be altered by the massive release of soot, chemicals, and greenhouse gases, triggering extreme weather patterns, disrupted rainfall, and agricultural collapse in areas far from the battlefields. What was once fertile farmland might turn barren, forcing survivors to scavenge for food in a world where nature itself has been destabilized. The war's impact on agriculture and food systems would be devastating. Crops could fail due to radioactive contamination or shifts in climate, while livestock populations might be decimated. Supply chains that once connected producers with markets would be severed, making even the most basic sustenance a challenge to acquire. Nations that relied on imports for essential foodstuffs could face starvation unless they find ways to cultivate their own resources under harsh, changed conditions. Water, too, would become a precious commodity. Rivers and reservoirs could be contaminated by chemical or nuclear fallout, forcing communities to rely on limited sources or attempt dangerous purification methods. The very elements we take for granted, earth, water, air, could be rendered hostile to human life in large swaths of the world. Even in areas that survived the worst of the attacks, the long-term psychological effect of devastation would be palpable. Landscapes would carry the weight of destruction, a constant reminder of the fragility of civilization. Abandoned cities and towns, stripped of inhabitants and overgrown with weeds or scorched into desolation, would become haunting symbols of what was lost. Survivors might find themselves living among ruins for years, adapting their lives to spaces never intended to shelter them, repurposing damaged buildings and navigating hazardous terrain. Nature, in some cases, might reclaim these spaces, creating surreal scenes where vegetation grows over crumbling highways or wildlife roams through the remnants of human life, indifferent to the collapse of societies around it. In the aftermath, the challenge would not only be survival but also the slow, painstaking task of rebuilding. Engineers, architects, and planners would face an unprecedented task, not just reconstructing cities, but doing so in a way that accounts for environmental hazards, scarcity of materials, and the unpredictable consequences of a world shaken by war. What might be rebuilt could look drastically different, designed for resilience rather than beauty, for functionality rather than leisure. And as these structures rise from the ruins, they would serve as a stark reminder of the war's reach, illustrating that the cost of global conflict is measured not only in lives lost but in the very landscapes that sustain life. The physical devastation after WW3 would be both total and enduring, a reality in which every aspect of daily life, from the buildings we inhabit to the food we eat, the water we drink, and the air we breathe, would be altered forever. Humanity's challenge would extend beyond politics and power. It would become a fight to reclaim the planet itself, to coax life back into ravaged cities and poisoned lands, and to find a fragile balance between survival and hope in a world scarred by unimaginable destruction. In the aftermath of a conflict as devastating as World War III, the human cost would extend far beyond the immediate casualties of war. Millions could find themselves uprooted, forced to abandon homes that no longer exist or territories rendered uninhabitable by destruction or radiation. Entire populations might be displaced, moving across borders in search of safety, food, or basic shelter. Refugee crises on a scale previously unimaginable could overwhelm remaining governments and aid organizations, creating tense environments where survival often depends on ingenuity, resourcefulness, and sometimes sheer luck. Communities that once felt secure in their nations could suddenly find themselves strangers in foreign lands, navigating unfamiliar languages, cultures, and legal systems while carrying the psychological weight of loss and trauma. The displacement of people would not just be a matter of geography, it would reshape societies in profound ways. Urban centers that survived the worst of the destruction might become overcrowded with waves of refugees, straining already limited resources and infrastructure. Rural regions, too, could face sudden influxes of displaced populations, forcing local communities to adapt to new realities and compete for essentials like food, water, and shelter. The social fabric of nations would be tested as trust becomes a scarce commodity and survival often necessitates difficult moral choices. In some cases, tensions between locals and newcomers could flare into conflict, adding another layer of instability to an already fragile environment. Healthcare systems, already weakened by war, would be under unimaginable pressure. Hospitals could be destroyed or overwhelmed, medical supplies scarce, and trained personnel dangerously limited. Diseases, both new and resurgent, might spread rapidly in crowded refugee camps or abandoned cities. Malnutrition and exposure to harsh environmental conditions would exacerbate vulnerability, leaving millions at risk of death even if they survived the direct violence of the war. Mental health crises, too, would reach staggering proportions. Survivors would carry trauma from witnessing unimaginable loss, from losing family members to seeing their homes and communities obliterated. Coping mechanisms would vary, but the collective psychological burden on entire populations would be immense, shaping behaviors and decisions for years to come. Children, especially, would bear the brunt of this upheaval. Many could grow up without schools, proper nutrition, or stable family structures. Their formative years would be spent navigating uncertainty, fear, and displacement, leaving long-term consequences for their development and the societies they eventually inhabit. Education itself could become a rare privilege, a fragmented patchwork of efforts by surviving communities or aid organizations attempting to provide some semblance of normalcy in a chaotic world. A generation raised amid such disruption could be resilient and resourceful, but also scarred by the trauma of a world turned upside down. Amid the chaos, survival strategies would emerge, often stark and improvisational. Communities might organize around shared resources or security, forming informal networks or temporary settlements that resemble something between villages and refugee camps. Barter systems could replace currency in areas where economies have collapsed, and social hierarchies might shift based on access to necessities rather than wealth or status. Entire cultures could be forced to adapt, evolving rapidly in response to scarcity, danger, and the need to protect the most vulnerable. Human ingenuity, however, would shine through even in the darkest circumstances. People would find ways to grow food in contaminated soil, purify water with makeshift methods, and create safe zones in areas where others cannot survive. Yet even as individuals adapt, the scale of displacement and suffering would fundamentally redefine the notion of community and nationhood. Borders might become less relevant as populations mix, flee, and resettle, creating hybrid societies that reflect survival rather than history. Governments, weakened or destroyed, might rely on humanitarian organizations, local militias, or self-organized communities to maintain basic order. Social cohesion would be fragile, dependent on cooperation and compromise in a world where every resource is contested. The very concept of normal life would shift, replaced by a daily negotiation with scarcity, danger, and loss, and by the persistent hope that stability could one day return. Ultimately, the human story after WW3 would be one of resilience and adaptation amid staggering loss. Displacement would redefine not just geography, but identity, community, and culture. Survival would become the most pressing concern, shaping generations in ways that the world might only slowly begin to understand. The physical devastation of cities and lands would be mirrored by the upheaval of human lives, creating a post-war reality where rebuilding society would be as urgent and monumental a task as rebuilding the cities themselves. In the aftermath of World War III, the remnants of military power and technology would shape the world in ways both terrifying and transformative. Weapons that were once the pinnacle of human ingenuity, nuclear arsenals, advanced drones, hypersonic missiles, and cyber warfare systems, would leave indelible marks not only on landscapes but on the geopolitical and social order. Some nations might retain their technological superiority, controlling access to crucial resources and infrastructure, while others could find themselves stripped of the tools that once defined their strength. The balance of power would no longer be determined solely by the number of troops or tanks, but by who can maintain, repair, and leverage the technologies that survived the war. In this new reality, innovation would be both a lifeline and a weapon, dictating which nations and communities can rebuild and which are left behind. The remnants of warfare technology would be a double-edged sword. On one hand, nations with intact research facilities or stockpiles of advanced equipment could leverage them to restore order, protect survivors, or assert dominance. Military robotics, artificial intelligence, and cyber capabilities might become essential tools not only for defense but also for reconstruction. On the other hand, leftover weapons and unstable materials could pose constant hazards. Nuclear waste, unexploded ordnance, and contaminated zones could linger for decades, turning areas into no-go zones and forcing survivors to navigate landscapes that are as deadly as they are desolate. The remnants of sophisticated warfare would thus become both a lifeline and a lingering threat, shaping the day-to-day reality of life after the conflict. The concept of security itself would be fundamentally altered. Traditional armies might be weakened or destroyed, replaced by smaller, highly adaptable forces capable of rapid deployment or specialized operations. Nations or regions that retain the ability to manufacture weapons could effectively control entire areas, creating pockets of influence where access to safety, resources, or information depends on technological superiority. Cyber warfare would likely remain a constant concern, with critical infrastructure vulnerable to attacks even in the absence of active combat. Digital networks could be weaponized not just to disrupt economies but to control communications, monitor populations, or enforce compliance, making survival as much a technological challenge as a physical one. Access to resources would define the contours of power. Fuel, energy, water, and raw materials would become the most coveted assets, and nations able to control these essentials would gain leverage far beyond their population size or geographic area. The ability to harness or repair technology, from solar grids to water purification systems, could determine who thrives and who merely survives. Innovation would no longer be about advancement for progress's sake, it would be about survival, security, and the ability to rebuild society in a fractured world. Those who can adapt technology to meet basic human needs would emerge as leaders, regardless of the pre-war status of their nation. The long-term consequences of a technological arms race gone awry would also reshape everyday life. Ordinary citizens might encounter AI systems, drones, or automated defenses in ways previously reserved for soldiers. Communities could develop ingenious methods to repurpose military technology for civilian survival, using robotic units to deliver supplies, repurposing vehicles for transportation or agriculture, or adapting communication systems to maintain contact with distant settlements. In this sense, the boundary between military and civilian life could blur, as technology intended for destruction becomes essential for the continuation of life itself. Yet the shadow of technology's destructive potential would never fully disappear. Radiation zones, chemical contamination, and malfunctioning automated systems would remind everyone that the tools humans once trusted for dominance could turn deadly if left unchecked. Nations would face the dual challenge of safeguarding these powerful tools while finding ways to rebuild with them, balancing ambition with caution, innovation with ethics. Leaders and communities alike would need to navigate a world in which one misstep with remaining technology could undo years of survival or reconstruction. Ultimately, the technological and military aftermath of World War III would define the post-war era as much as politics or geography. Survival would depend on the ability to adapt, control, and repair technology while avoiding its persistent dangers. The war's legacy would be measured not just in destroyed cities or displaced populations, but in the power dynamics created by access to and mastery of tools that can both preserve life and annihilate it. In this new world, humanity's ingenuity would be its greatest asset, and its most dangerous temptation.